We tend to think of really important conversations as like the big ones, right? Like negotiating a deal or having, one of those serious talks with a loved one. But what if I told you that just your average everyday chit chat actually carries some surprising weight?
Yeah, I think we often take for granted just how much we rely on clear communication in pretty much every aspect of our lives.
Right. Consider this. So get this. Communication failures in American hospitals between 2009 and 2013 actually contributed to, get this, over 1,700 deaths.
Wow. That's a really sobering statistic.
It is. Think about it. Misread charts, unshared vital information, anxious families not fully grasping the complexities of medical care. It really makes you realize just how much is riding on even the simplest exchanges.
Absolutely. And it's not just those kind of like, high-stakes environments where this matters. Think about your own life. Have you ever, walked out of a job interview just kind of wondering, like, did I actually get my point across? Did they really understand my skills? Or maybe you've had like a little misunderstanding with a friend that kind of festered longer than it should have.
Yeah, or what about those holiday dinners, where like a casual political comment suddenly spirals into a full-blown shouting match?
Right. We've all been in those conversations that just went totally sideways.
We have. And the good news is that we can all learn to navigate these interactions, a little more effectively. I mean, I know I've had my fair share of communication mishaps over the years.
I think we all have. It's definitely a learning process.
It really is. And for me, it kind of hit home when I was reading those cockpit transcripts from Flight 90. It just made me think about all the times I've struggled to articulate my thoughts or completely missed what someone else was trying to tell me. It's something we've all experienced in some form or another, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a universal experience. It's just part of being human.
Yeah. Those moments where we just can't seem to get our point across or we totally misunderstand what someone's saying. It happens. And sometimes those miscommunications, they cost us something.
Yeah, like an opportunity or a connection or something like that.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some of my most profound insights about communication have actually come from my own mess ups.
I think that's true for a lot of us. We learn so much from our mistakes, especially in how we communicate.
And there's this one particular experience that really stands out to me. It taught me a really powerful lesson about the importance of really, truly listening.
I'm curious to hear about it. It sounds like it had a big impact on you.
It did. So picture this. It's just 2 days after that just devastating earthquake in Haiti back in 2010. And I'm on the air talking with this woman named Mallory Thurlow. Now, for 2 really long and agonizing days, she'd been desperately trying to reach her fiancé in Port-au-Prince. Understandably, she's incredibly anxious, just wanting to know if he was even alive. And our team was amazing. They actually managed to locate her fiancé, France Neptune.
Wow.
And we connected them live on the air. It was an incredibly emotional moment, Hearing their voices after such a terrifying ordeal, just the relief in their voices was palpable. My co-host and I, we just kind of stepped back and let them talk. You could hear just the raw emotion pouring through. And it was a powerful experience for everyone involved. But here's where I kind of messed up.
Oh.
I got so caught up in the success of making that connection happen that I lost sight of what was actually happening in the conversation.
Easy to get swept up in the moment, especially when you're dealing with such powerful emotions.
Yeah, I think I was so focused on the narrative of this reunion, that I didn't fully hear what was being communicated, and we weren't anticipating what happened next.
I see what you're saying. Sometimes those unexpected turns in a conversation can catch us off guard.
They really can. So here we are, this incredible reunion live on the air, and then France shares with Mallory the news that her young godchild had died in the collapse of a school.
Oh, wow. That must have been incredibly difficult for everyone involved.
It was. Mallory was just devastated. I was speechless, and the atmosphere in the studio just completely changed. Looking back, I can only imagine how painful it was for our listeners, too, like feeling like they were intruding on this deeply personal tragedy.
That's a really tough situation to navigate, especially in a live broadcast.
Yeah.
It's hard to know how to respond in those kinds of moments.
It really is. And we got a lot of feedback afterward. People felt like maybe we hadn't handled it as sensitively as we could have.
And it probably wasn't what they were expecting to hear on the radio either.
Right. Hearing someone process raw grief like that can be really tough for listeners,
Yeah.
Like they want to offer comfort, but they can't. And they often look to the host in those situations for guidance.
I can see that. And sometimes there just aren't the right words.
No, there aren't. And I think if I had been truly listening to the subtle cues in the conversation, maybe I would have sensed that shift a little earlier. I could have handled the segment differently, maybe ended it there to give them some privacy. But instead, I was so caught up in my own perspective of, facilitating this reunion that I didn't fully hear what was being said and where the conversation might be heading.
That makes a lot of sense. It's a good reminder that sometimes our own focus or preconceived notions can prevent us from really hearing and responding to the emotional reality of the other person in the conversation.
It's a powerful lesson.
Yeah.
And one that I've carried with me ever since.
I can imagine. It's the kind of experience that really stays with you.
It does. Now, fast forward to 1999. I just finished my master's degree, and my fiancé was overseas, so I was in Arizona with our young son. And just by chance, I ended up visiting KNAU Arizona Public Radio. They were interviewing my mother about her father, my grandfather. He was a well-regarded composer, really significant figure in his field.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, my mom often did interviews about him. And I just happened to be there that day. And here's where things get interesting.
Okay.
The music director at KNAU happened to be an old acquaintance of mine. We started chatting, just casual conversation, catching up. And honestly, I can't even recall exactly what we talked about, but out of the blue, she asked me, so do you want a job?
Wow. Just like that.
Pretty much. They were looking for a weekend classical music announcer. And apparently finding someone with the right qualifications isn't always easy.
I can imagine it's a pretty specialized role.
It is. You need someone with a solid knowledge of classical music who can pronounce all those tricky composer names, the whole package.
Yeah, you got to be able to handle the Tchaikovskys and the Rachmaninoffs.
Exactly. And I had 2 music degrees, and not only could I pronounce Tchaikovsky, I could also tell you some of the fascinating stories behind the music and the composers.
So you were a perfect fit.
Pretty much. I ended up taking the job. And that unexpected conversation really changed the course of my entire career.
It's amazing how those seemingly random conversations can lead to such unexpected opportunities.
Yeah.
It really highlights the power of just being present and open in our interactions.
It really does. And that one casual conversation led to a career in public radio, local announcing, reporting, hosting for NPR and PRI, even opportunities with CNN, the BBC, PBS. It's safe to say I've learned a thing or two about communication along the way.
I'd say so. You've had quite a journey.
Yeah, it's been quite a ride. But it's funny. The moments that really stick with me, the ones I keep coming back to, are the times where I struggled to connect, where I didn't fully understand someone, or maybe I just didn't get my own point across clearly.
That's so interesting. It's like those challenges, those moments of miscommunication are the ones that really shape us.
They are. And it makes you think about the bigger picture, doesn't it? Like our conversations have real consequences, like that butterfly effect.
Right. Our words and actions, even in seemingly insignificant exchanges, can ripple outwards and have unintended effects.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important, to learn how to really engage with each other, especially with people whose views are different from our own. Because in the real world, you can't just, click unfollow.
That's such a good point. We can't just shut ourselves off from people who think differently in real life.
And that's what this whole deep dive is about for me. Like exploring why we so often talk at each other instead of with each other, and how we can all become better listeners.
I love that. Because at its core, conversation is really about connection. It's about building bridges and understanding.
It really is. And it's such a fundamental human skill, Even the word converse comes from the Latin meaning to turn together.
Wow. I never knew that. It's such a beautiful way to think about it, like this idea of evolving together through dialogue.
Right. It's not just about exchanging information. It's about this shared experience of, turning towards each other. Some biologists even believe that the development of nuanced conversation was actually a key factor in our species' success.
That makes a lot of sense. Like our ability to communicate complex ideas, to cooperate, to build social structures, it all hinges on our ability to have meaningful conversations.
It does. And that brings us to, the human element in our modern world. There's this really thought-provoking article by Paul Burnwell in The Atlantic called "My Students Don't Know How to Have a Conversation." And he makes this really interesting point that conversational competence might be the single most overlooked skill we fail to teach students.
That's a really powerful statement.
It is. Think about it. Young people today spend so much time interacting through screens, yet they often have very limited opportunities to actually develop those essential face-to-face communication skills in real time.
It's more than just, typical teenage awkwardness. It's like our reliance on digital communication is actually impacting our ability to engage in meaningful in-person dialogue.
Exactly. And it raises this almost like fundamental question. In the 21st century, what could possibly be more important than being able to have a confident and coherent conversation?
It's true. We live in a world that's increasingly reliant on effective communication across all sorts of platforms and contexts.
Right. And even when we do manage to, put our devices aside, technology presents another kind of challenge, like our willingness to even engage in potentially difficult conversations in the first place.
Well, that's an interesting point, like how technology might actually be making us more hesitant to have those tough conversations.
Exactly. There was this 2014 Pew Research study that found that people are actually less likely to share their opinions in person if they know that those opinions are unpopular online.
That's so ironic, isn't it? Like social media, which was supposed to be this platform for diverse voices, might actually be creating a climate where people are afraid to speak up in the real world.
Right. It's this weird unintended consequence. And it made me think about my own conversational habits. When I was working on my book, I actually started tracking my face-to-face conversations each day.
Oh, wow. Really? I've never heard of anyone doing that before.
It was really eye-opening. Before I started, I probably would have guessed that I had, several meaningful conversations every day.
Like 5, 6, 7.
Yeah, something like that. But actually keeping track, like a careful tally, it revealed that most days it was closer to 1 or 2, sometimes even none.
That's really surprising.
It is. And it felt like more, because I was constantly connected, like texts, emails, all that. But I wasn't often truly talking with people.
That's such a key distinction, isn't it? Like just exchanging information versus having a real dialogue.
It is. True conversation involves this, reciprocal flow of ideas and a genuine engagement with the other person's thoughts and feelings.
Absolutely. It's about connecting on a deeper level.
And it's funny, after I give talks, people often come up to me with questions, and 9 times out of 10, their questions are about, how to deal with other people's perceived conversational shortcomings. Like, what do you do when someone dominates the conversation? Or how do you handle someone who constantly repeats themselves? Or what if they barely say anything at all?
Right. It's always about the other person.
Always. But here's the thing I almost never hear. I tend to interrupt people. How can I stop? Or I find myself zoning out when others are speaking. How can I improve my focus? It's like we have this tendency to attribute conversational difficulties entirely to the other person.
It's so true. It's much easier to point out the flaws in others than to examine our own behavior.
Right, like an awkward date. Oh, they were a terrible conversationalist. A tense family argument. My relative is just being difficult. We rarely stop to consider our own role in those interactions.
It's a classic case of externalizing blame. It's a very human tendency.
It is. And most people seem to think they're already pretty good at this whole conversation thing. Like if you're listening to this, you probably recognize there's room for improvement, but you probably still believe you're better than average at conversation.
Well, I'm certainly guilty of that. I think most of us are.
I get it. I used to think the same way. It took some pretty significant missteps, to realize that I had a lot to learn. And unfortunately, research kind of supports this tendency to overestimate our abilities. David Dunning from Cornell University has done some fascinating research on this. He found that most people find it intrinsically difficult to get a sense of what they don't know. Like we tend to have this inflated view of our abilities across all sorts of social and intellectual domains.
It's like the less we know about something, the more confident we are in our abilities. It's a bit paradoxical.
It really is. And here's another interesting point. Research even suggests that highly intelligent people can often be poor communicators.
Really? That's surprising.
Isn't it? And in fact, the more intelligent you are, the worse you might be. Now, I like to think I have a reasonable level of intelligence. After all these years of interviewing experts in all these different fields, you kind of develop a sense of where you stand.
Right. You're exposed to so many brilliant minds.
But I used to equate being articulate with being a good conversationalist. And that's simply not true. Being a good speaker doesn't automatically make you a good listener. And in some cases, being highly intelligent might actually hinder your listening skills.
That's so counterintuitive. Like you'd think that being smart would make you a better communicator.
You would think so, right? But it's not always the case. And I think part of it is that intelligent people can sometimes overestimate the clarity and logic of their own communication. They might assume that everyone understands them as easily as they understand themselves.
Right, and they might not even realize that they're not being clear.
Exactly. And intelligence can also be a barrier to good conversation because intelligent people can be reluctant to ask for clarification. There's this assumption that they should just naturally grasp complex ideas quickly.
Like they're afraid to admit that they don't understand something.
Right. Especially if they're talking to someone they perceive as, less knowledgeable. Acknowledging a lack of understanding can feel like, admitting a weakness.
It's like it challenges their self-perception of being intelligent.
Exactly. So I really encourage everyone to kind of take a step back and consider your own contributions to the conversations you have. Like, our perception of our communication skills is often quite different from reality.
That's a great point. We all have blind spots when it comes to how we communicate.
We do. So here's a little challenge. The next time you're in a conversation that doesn't go well, try asking for feedback. Just let the other person know that, the exchange didn't quite land as you hoped, and that you're curious if there was anything you could have said differently or focused on more effectively or simply understood better.
That's a really good idea. It takes courage to ask for that kind of feedback, but it can be so valuable.
It can, and here's the key. You have to really listen to their perspective without getting defensive. Maybe start with someone you trust. Like, receiving constructive criticism isn't always easy, but if you're serious about improving as a conversationalist, getting an honest assessment of where you can grow is invaluable.
It's true. Feedback is essential for growth in any area of life.
And, for me, once I kind of acknowledged that I was at least partly responsible for some of the less successful conversations I'd had, I finally started to see where I was going wrong.
It's like that moment of self-awareness where you can start to identify those patterns in your own behavior.
Exactly. And I started paying much closer attention to my own conversations. Particularly in my professional life in the radio studio, I'd listen back to recordings and I'd note, instances where I could have asked better questions or really heard what a guest was saying.
It's like you were actively studying your own communication style.
I was. And it's no surprise that as my listening skills improved, the quality of my conversations both on and off the air also improved. Guests who were initially hesitant started to open up more, and guests who tended to go off on tangents, they became more focused.
It's amazing how much of a difference our own behavior can make in the dynamic of a conversation.
It really is. And the key takeaway here is that in conversations, just like in life, you can't control the other person's words or actions. You can only control your own. But sometimes just that shift in your own approach can make all the difference.
That's a powerful reminder. We have more control over our conversations than we might realize.
We do. And one of my all-time favorite interviewees is the novelist Salman Rushdie. I've had the privilege of interviewing him more than anyone else in my career. And what I really appreciate about talking with him is that he genuinely listens to my questions. And he takes the time to thoughtfully answer what I've actually asked. Sometimes he even pauses, just for a moment to consider his response before speaking. That's so rare, especially in an industry where so many people are just waiting to jump in with their talking points.
It is. And here's a little exercise I used to do to better understand my own conversational tendencies. I'd make a list of all the things that people do in conversation that I find irritating. Do they interrupt? Do they ramble? Do they constantly bring the focus back to themselves? I'd write it all down. And then I'd share that list with trusted friends and colleagues. And I'd ask them to honestly tell me how many of those behaviors they observed in my own communication style.
Oh, wow. That's a bold move. I bet that was a little nerve-wracking.
It was.
Yeah.
But it was also incredibly insightful.
It's a good reminder that we all have those little habits that we might not even be aware of.
We do. And, when I come across conversational advice like nod frequently and say, to show you're engaged, I just can't help but think about my own attempts to do that.
Right. Like those little scripts that we try to follow.
What I discovered was that, consciously trying to nod, it just feels forced. And it often comes across as inauthentic to the other person. It's like they can sense that you're not really present.
Exactly. And the advice to maintain constant eye contact, often equally unhelpful, sometimes even counterproductive. I remember one job interview where I was really trying to, maintain that intense eye contact. And the HR representative actually asked me quite seriously if I'd had too much caffeine.
No.
She said, "You seem really intense," with this kind of nervous chuckle. Definitely not the impression I was going for. So after trying so many of these standard pieces of conversational advice and finding that most of them felt, contrived or unrealistic, I started to question my whole understanding of what actually constitutes good communication.
That makes sense. It's like you're challenging those ingrained assumptions.
Yeah. Like maybe a lot of what I had absorbed over the years was simply misguided, Like maybe the strategies I'd tried to memorize weren't actually as effective as I'd believed. I had to kind of strip away all those preconceived notions and start with a more open perspective. And I had to acknowledge that when it came to, the art of conversation, maybe I wasn't as naturally skilled as I had assumed.
That's a really humble realization. But it's also really important because it allows us to start learning and growing.
It does. It's like you can't improve if you don't acknowledge that there's room for improvement. And I had this experience once where I had a guest on my show who was visibly upset after his interview.
Oh, no. What happened?
Well, it was a relatively short segment, only about 5 minutes. And he was actually quite angry because he had prepared to speak for 15.
Oh, I see. So he felt like he didn't have enough time to get his point across.
Yeah. Exactly. And at the time, one of my producers kind of dismissed it, but it really stuck with me. I kept thinking about it. And I tried to see it from the professor's perspective. He probably spent a lot of time preparing, organizing his thoughts, maybe even rehearsing. He had this clear vision of how the interview would go and the key points he wanted to convey. And then it ended so abruptly that he didn't have the chance to share much of what he had worked on. And it wasn't until years later when another guest, also a professor, had a similar reaction to a shorter than expected interview that I really grasped the significance of that earlier experience.
It's like that second experience illuminated something for you about the first one.
It did. It highlighted for me the importance of considering the other person's expectations and the effort they invest in preparing for a conversation, even a brief one.
Right. We often underestimate how much people put into those interactions.
And then there was this other time, this young woman came into my studio for her very first live radio interview. And she was so nervous, fidgeting, taking frequent sips of water. I asked her gently if she was feeling okay, and she said, more than a little. I tried to reassure her, And then she asked if I could walk her through exactly how the interview would proceed step by step.
Oh, wow. She needed that reassurance.
She did, and that's when something clicked for me. This became one of the most important lessons I've learned as a journalist. Clearly explain what you want and what you expect, and be honest about the process.
It's all about setting clear expectations from the outset.
Right. Now, when my guests sit down, I always say something like, I'll read a brief introduction and then introduce you. We have approximately 12 minutes to talk, which will pass quickly. So please try to keep your answers focused. If you see me begin to nod or hold up my finger, it means we're approaching our time limit, so please wrap up your current thought. Just those few simple sentences can make a huge difference.
I can see that. It's like you're giving them a roadmap for the conversation.
Yeah, exactly. It helps them feel more at ease and in control. It's amazing how much anxiety can be alleviated just by clearly articulating expectations.
It's a simple but really effective strategy.
It is. And another crucial thing I've learned is to take a moment to check in with myself before engaging in an important discussion. Like, how am I feeling? Am I anxious, distracted, irritated? Because all of those internal states are going to influence my tone, even my facial expressions.
Right. Our emotions always leak out in some way.
Yeah, I do. And I have to admit, my face is remarkably expressive. You can pretty much see every thought that crosses my mind. It makes me a terrible liar and an exceptionally bad poker player.
Well, I bet.
You might think it wouldn't matter much on the radio since the audience can't see me. But the person I'm interviewing certainly can. And they often have a pretty good idea of what I'm thinking. So we bring this whole set of expectations to every conversation, no matter how brief. It's all those thoughts and feelings swirling around in our minds before anyone even utters a word. And while we can't always control, how a conversation will unfold, we can certainly cultivate an environment that's conducive to open and authentic communication by sharing our expectations and being mindful of our own internal landscape.
That's beautifully put. It's like preparing the soil before we plant the seeds of dialogue.
That's a great way to put it. And, a truly good conversation isn't necessarily an easy one. There are sensitive subjects, emotionally charged topics that can be challenging to navigate. However, I believe there isn't a single person on this planet with whom you share absolutely no common ground. And there isn't a topic so volatile that it inherently cannot be discussed.
That's a really hopeful perspective. I think it's so easy to get caught up in our differences and forget that we all share this common humanity.
We do. Let me tell you about Zernona Clayton. She was born in the 1930s in Oklahoma, and she was deeply involved in the civil rights movement. She worked closely with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and later in her life, she developed this extraordinary friendship with a leader of the Ku Klux Klan.
Wow, that's incredible.
It is. It's an amazing testament to the power of dialogue. Even across seemingly insurmountable divides. And through stories like Sonona Clayton's and through my own experiences, I've identified 5 key strategies that can really enhance productive, even difficult dialogues. Be curious, check your bias, show respect, stay the course, and end well.
I love that. It's a great framework for approaching any challenging conversation.
And the first of these being curious, it really centers on this genuine desire to learn something from the other person. Like Sonona Clayton, she didn't engage with that KKK leader with the intention of, lecturing him or proving him wrong.
It wasn't about winning a debate.
No. She was genuinely curious to understand the underlying beliefs that fueled his views. To connect with the person behind those opinions, that directly threatened her very existence.
That's a powerful example of how curiosity can bridge even the most extreme divides.
It is. And so often we make these really rapid judgments about people. We hear certain key words, maybe related to politics or religion, and we instantly categorize them. Like we put them in this mental box with everyone else who seems to share those views.
Right. It's like we're constantly trying to simplify the world around us by putting people into neat little categories.
Exactly. But the problem is that those kinds of broad groupings are rarely accurate. Think about arranging a playmate for your child. You connect with the other parent, you discuss logistics, you make sure you feel comfortable in trusting them with your child's safety. You might have this perfectly pleasant conversation about, local events or the weather.
Right, just normal small talk.
But would you automatically know their specific parenting style or their household rules just based on their political affiliations? Like, just because you might agree on the importance of environmental conservation doesn't necessarily mean you'll agree on, the best way to discipline a child.
That's such a good point. We can't assume that agreement on one issue automatically translates to agreement on everything else.
Right. And using broad social or political values as a shortcut to understanding someone's individual values can lead to inaccurate and sometimes even, negative assumptions.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that everyone is an individual with their own unique set of beliefs and experiences.
And here's a perfect example. I was in an airport engrossed in this book called Blood at the Root. It recounts the expulsion of all African Americans from Forsyth County, Georgia back in 1912. And this white woman sitting across from me inquired about the book, and we started talking. And she shared that she grew up in this all-white town. And she vividly remembered when a Mexican family moved in and the absolutely appalling way they were treated. Local businesses wouldn't acknowledge them, wouldn't even speak to them. It was this truly awful experience, to witness. And as she was sharing this, I realized that I had unconsciously made an assumption about her based on her background. Yet her story demonstrated this really clear understanding of prejudice and exclusion.
Wow, that's a powerful reminder that we should never judge a book by its cover.
It really is. Like, we have to be willing to listen to individual narratives rather than just relying on these broad generalizations.
It's about seeing the person, not the stereotype.
Exactly. And you know what else can be incredibly effective in a conversation, particularly when things are getting a little tense? Offering a sincere apology.
An apology. That's an interesting one.
It can be really powerful. To truly apologize, you first have to understand why the other person is upset. And that requires empathy, like a genuine attempt to step into their shoes for a moment.
Right. It's not just about saying, I'm sorry. It's about acknowledging their feelings and understanding their perspective.
Exactly. So in that airport conversation, after I realized, my own implicit bias, I sincerely apologized to the woman if I had inadvertently made her feel unfairly labeled. I acknowledged her pain and the injustice she had witnessed, regardless of whether I fully agreed with every nuance of her experience. And you know what? She visibly softened. Her defensiveness kind of lessened, and she became much more receptive to further conversation.
It's amazing how a simple apology can de-escalate a situation and create space for understanding.
It is. And this principle, it extends far beyond everyday disagreements. Consider German Chancellor Willy Brandt kneeling at the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial back in 1970. This was a man who had fled Nazi Germany, had his citizenship revoked, and had actively worked against Hitler. He bore no direct responsibility for the atrocities committed there. Yet his spontaneous act of kneeling in humble grief, it resonated profoundly around the world. It was seen as this powerful symbol of Germany's remorse, and it marked this really significant step forward in relations with Poland and Eastern Europe. He was even awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts.
Wow, it's a powerful example of how nonverbal communication can speak volumes.
It really is. And what's so compelling is that those same fundamental principles of effective conversation, being present, listening attentively, showing genuine respect, they're applicable in countless settings, not just formal interviews or high-stakes negotiations. Every conversation, in its own way, holds unique significance.
That's a beautiful thought. It's
Yeah.
like we should approach every interaction with that same level of care and attention.
We should. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about some more specific strategies for having better conversations. The first crucial principle we need to internalize is this: be fully present or choose to be elsewhere.
I love that. It's so simple but so profound.
It sounds straightforward, right? But in our hyper-connected world, it's become increasingly challenging. The reality is our brains just aren't really designed for true multitasking, especially when the tasks engage the same cognitive functions.
It's like trying to run two apps on your phone at the same time that both require a lot of processing power. It just slows everything down.
Right. So trying to talk and simultaneously read or write, it's just not efficient. It leads to what's known as interference. So if you're glancing at your phone during a conversation or scrolling through social media, you're inevitably going to miss subtle cues, important details, and potentially the entire point the other person is trying to make.
Right. It's like you're only getting a fraction of the information.
And research from the University of Minnesota even indicates that we struggle to recall information we're told, even when we think we're actively listening. And after a relatively short period, that recall diminishes even further. So engaging in a conversation with only half of your attention is ultimately unproductive. It's not enough to just put your phone face down on the table if your mind is still racing with, emails and notifications and to-do lists.
Right. You have to be mentally present as well.
You do. You need to be truly present in that moment. And if for whatever reason you find that you just can't fully focus, it's far more respectful to politely excuse yourself from the conversation than to just, offer a fraction of your attention.
That's a good point. It's better to be honest about your limitations than to pretend to be engaged when you're not.
Exactly. You could say something like, "I'm so sorry, but I'm having trouble concentrating right now. I really do want to hear what you're saying. Can we maybe revisit this a little later?" And I actually learned this principle through a really painful experience. Yeah, I remember this friend of mine had just lost her father, and she was understandably heartbroken. And I found her sitting alone, just looking utterly lost. I wanted to